The church was silent, save for the soft murmurs of mourners and the occasional creak of wooden pews. Father Edward stood at the altar, his hands trembling slightly as he held the Bible. He had performed countless funerals, but this one felt different. The weight of the room pressed on him, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The coffin lay at the center of the aisle, its polished surface reflecting the dim candlelight. Edward's eyes drifted to the small photograph placed atop it. A young woman smiling brightly, her eyes full of life. He recognized her instantly. It was Amelia. His chest tightened, and he forced himself to look away, focusing on the words he was meant to recite. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," he began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. As he spoke, his gaze wandered to the mourners. Most were strangers, but a few faces stood out, faces from a past he had tried to bury. He clenched his jaw, pushing the memories aside. It was when he stepped down from the altar to bless the coffin that he noticed something strange. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, seemed to come from within the wooden box. He paused, his hand hovering over the lid. The mourners shifted uncomfortably, their whispers growing louder. Edward leaned closer, his heart pounding. There it was again, a soft, rhythmic tapping. His breath caught. He glanced around, but no one else seemed to have heard it. Swallowing hard, he placed his hand on the lid, his fingers brushing against the cold metal handle. The room fell silent, as if sensing his hesitation. With a deep breath, he lifted the lid just enough to peer inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Amelia's eyes were open, staring directly at him. Her lips moved, forming a single word: Charlie. Edward stumbled back, the lid slamming shut. The sound echoed through the church, drawing gasps from the crowd. His mind raced, his past crashing into the present. Charlie. That name, his name, hadn't been spoken in years. He looked around, but the mourners were staring at him, confusion and concern etched on their faces. "Father?" one of them asked, breaking the silence. Edward didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the coffin, his heart pounding in his chest. He had buried his guilt, his mistakes, his very identity when he became Father Edward. But now it seemed the past had come back to claim him. Edward's hands shook as he closed the Bible and stepped away from the coffin. The murmurs of the mourners grew louder, but he barely heard them. His mind was a whirlwind of memories, each one sharper than the last. He needed air, space, anything to escape the suffocating weight of the church. He hurried out through a side door, the cold evening breeze hitting his face like a slap. The cemetery stretched before him, rows of headstones glowing faintly under the moonlight. He leaned against the stone wall trying to steady his breathing, but the image of Amelia's open eyes haunted him, her voice echoing in his ears. Charlie. It had been years since anyone had called him that. Charlie was the man he used to be, a man who had made a terrible mistake, a man who had run from his past. He had thought he'd left that life behind when he joined the church, burying Charlie under layers of penance and prayer. But now it seemed the past had clawed its way back to the surface. He closed his eyes and the memories came flooding back. He had been a paramedic then, young and idealistic, desperate to save lives. One night, he had been called to a car accident. A young girl, no older than 10, had been trapped in the wreckage. He had tried everything to free her, but the fire had spread too quickly. He could still hear her screams, still feel the heat of the flames as he was forced to retreat. She had died that night, and he had carried the guilt ever since. That guilt had driven him to the church, to a life of service and sacrifice. He had thought it would bring him peace, but it never did. And now Amelia, her face so similar to the girl he couldn't save, had appeared in his life, only to vanish again. Or so he had thought. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see a woman approaching, her face pale and drawn. It was Amelia's mother. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes red from crying. "Father," she said softly, "thank you for the service. It was beautiful." Edward nodded, though the words felt hollow. He wanted to ask her about Amelia, about the strange moment at the coffin, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he said, "She was loved. That much is clear." The woman's lips trembled, and she looked away. "She was," she whispered, But there's so much I didn't know about her. So much I'll never understand. Edward frowned. What do you mean? She hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. I found this in her room, she said, handing it to him. I don't know what it means, but I thought you should see it. Edward unfolded the paper, his heart pounding. It was a letter, written in a shaky hand. The words were simple, but they sent a chill down his spine. Dear Charlie, I know it's you. I've always known. Please don't run away again. We need to talk. Amelia. He stared at the letter, his mind racing. How had she known? And what did she mean by, we need to talk? He looked up, but Amelia's mother was already walking away, her figure disappearing into the shadows of the cemetery. Edward folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know what it meant, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not yet. Edward returned to the church, his steps heavy. The mourners had dispersed, leaving the building eerily quiet. He walked to the front pew and sat down, staring at the altar. The coffin was still there, its lid closed, but the image of Amelia's open eyes lingered in his mind. He pulled the letter from his pocket and read it again, his hands trembling. Dear Charlie, I know it's you. I've always known. Please don't run away again. We need to talk. Amelia. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that crushed him. How had Amelia known his real name? He had buried Charlie so deeply, so completely, that even he had almost forgotten who he was. And yet, she had seen through him. She had known. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands. The memories came rushing back, unbidden. He had met Amelia a year ago when she had come to the church seeking help. She had been young, lost, and desperate, her life spiraling out of control. He had tried to guide her, to offer her the same solace he had found in the church. But she had been different from the others. There was something about her, a spark, a resilience that had drawn him in. He had cared for her, perhaps more than he should have. And now she was gone. Or was she? The tapping from the coffin, her open eyes, the letter. It all pointed to something he couldn't explain. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to start. He stood abruptly, the letter clutched in his hand. He would go to her house. Maybe there, he would find something, anything, that could help him understand. He left the church, the cool night air doing little to calm his racing thoughts. The streets were quiet, the town asleep. He walked quickly, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. Amelia's house was a small, modest building on the edge of town. The lights were off, the windows dark. He hesitated at the gate, then pushed it open and walked up the path to the front door. It was unlocked as if someone had been expecting him. He stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of flowers and candle wax. The living room was exactly as he remembered it. Simple, cozy, filled with the small touches that made it uniquely Amelia's. He moved through the house, his eyes scanning the room for anything that might give him a clue. And then he saw it, a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a picture of Amelia, but she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a man Edward recognized instantly. It was himself, Charlie. He stared at the photograph, his heart pounding. He didn't remember it being taken, but there he was, smiling beside her. How was this possible? He picked up the photograph, his hands shaking. On the back, written in Amelia's handwriting, were the words, "The day we met, the day everything changed." Edward's mind raced. He had no memory of this moment, no memory of ever meeting Amelia before she came to the church. And yet, here was proof that he had. What was happening? What had he forgotten? He set the photograph down and turned to leave, but something caught his eye. A small notebook lay on the coffee table, its pages filled with Amelia's handwriting. He picked it up and began to read, his heart sinking with every word. Dear Diary, today I saw him again. Charlie. He doesn't remember me, but I remember him. He saved me once, a long time ago. I was just a child trapped in a burning car. He tried to save me, but he couldn't. I survived, but he never knew. He thought I died that night, and now he's here, in this town, trying to save people again. But he's still running from the past. I need to help him. I need to make him see that he's already saved me, even if he doesn't know it. Edward's breath caught in his throat. The girl from the car accident, it had been Amelia. She had survived, and she had known who he was all along. He sank to his knees, the notebook slipping from his hands. The guilt he had carried for so long, the guilt that had driven him to the church, had been based on a lie. She had lived, and she had tried to tell him, to show him, but he had been too blind to see. Tears streamed down his face as the weight of it all came crashing down. He had spent years punishing himself for a mistake that wasn't a mistake at all, and now Amelia was gone, and he would never have the chance to thank her, to tell her how much her forgiveness meant to him. But as he sat there lost in his grief, a sound broke the silence. A soft knock at the door. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly he stood and walked to the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He opened it, and there she was. Amelia. Edward stared at Amelia, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. She stood on the doorstep, her face pale but alive, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath. Amelia, Edward finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. How is this possible? She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to scare you. I needed you to know the truth. Edward's legs felt weak, and he leaned against the wall for support. The truth? He repeated, his voice breaking. You were in the coffin. I saw you. I heard you. How are you here? Amelia looked down, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. It wasn't me in the coffin, she said quietly. It was a trick, a way to get your attention. I knew you wouldn't listen otherwise. You've been running from your past for so long, Charlie. I needed you to face it. Edward's chest tightened. But the letter, the photograph, you knew who I was all along? She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Yes, I've known since the day I came to the church. I recognized you immediately. You were the man who tried to save me all those years ago. The man who thought he failed. Edward's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor. I thought you died, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I thought I let you die. I've carried that guilt every day since. Amelia knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You didn't fail me, Charlie. You saved me. The firemen arrived just after you left. They pulled me out. I survived because of you. But by the time I woke up in the hospital, you were gone. No one knew who you were or where you went. I spent years looking for you, and when I finally found you, you were different. You were Father Edward. Edward looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. I became a priest because I thought I didn't deserve to be happy. I thought I had to atone for what happened. But you don't, Amelia said firmly. You've punished yourself enough. You've spent your life helping others, trying to make up for something that wasn't even your fault. It's time to forgive yourself, Charlie. It's time to live. Edward shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I don't know how. I don't know if I can. Amelia took his hand, her grip strong and steady. You don't have to do it alone. I'm here. I've always been here, and I'm not going anywhere. For the first time in years, Edward felt a glimmer of hope. The weight on his chest began to lift, just a little. He looked at Amelia, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman she had become, but the girl she had been, the girl he had tried to save. She was alive. She was here. And she was offering him a chance at redemption, at forgiveness, at love. What do we do now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Amelia smiled, a small, sad smile. We start over. We take it one day at a time. And we don't look back. Edward nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of emotions he hadn't felt in years. Hope, relief, and something else. Something warm and unfamiliar. Love. He squeezed Amelia's hand, feeling the strength in her grip, the strength she had always had, even as a child. Okay, he said softly. We start over. The days that followed were a blur for Edward. Amelia stayed by his side, helping him navigate the storm of emotions he had buried for so long. They spent hours talking, unraveling the past, and piecing together the fragments of their shared history. For the first time in years, Edward felt like he could breathe. The guilt that had weighed him down for so long began to loosen its grip, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. But not everyone was ready to let go of the past. The town was small and news traveled fast. Whispers began to spread about the strange events at the funeral, about the priest who had opened the coffin and the woman who had supposedly come back from the dead. Some called it a miracle, others a hoax. Edward knew he couldn't ignore the rumors forever. He had to face the consequences of his actions, both as Charlie and as Father Edward. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Edward and Amelia sat on the steps of the church, the cool breeze rustling the leaves around them. The silence between them was comfortable, but Edward could tell something was on Amelia's mind. "What is it?" he asked, breaking the quiet. She hesitated, then turned to him, her expression serious. "We can't stay here, Charlie. The town, they'll never understand. They'll never let us move on." Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but this is my home. This church, these people, they've been my life for so long. I don't know if I can just leave it all behind." Amelia placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "You're not leaving it behind. You're choosing to move forward. You've spent your life serving others, trying to make up for something that wasn't your fault. It's time to live for yourself now. For us." Edward looked at her, his heart aching with the truth of her words. She was right. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding behind the walls he had built. If he wanted to truly find peace, he had to let go of the past. Not just the guilt, but the life he had created to escape it. "Where would we go?" he asked quietly. Amelia smiled, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "Anywhere. Somewhere new, where we can start over. Where no one knows us as Charlie or Father Edward. Just us." Edward nodded slowly, the idea taking root in his mind. It was terrifying, but also exhilarating. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of possibility, of freedom. He reached for Amelia's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "Let's go." The decision to leave was easier than Edward had expected. He packed his few belongings quietly, leaving behind the vestments and symbols of his life as a priest. Amelia waited for him at the edge of town, her face lit with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. They left under the cover of night, the moon casting a soft glow over the empty streets. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Edward felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't running away anymore. He was moving towards something, a new life, a new beginning. Emilia sat beside him in the car, her hand resting on his arm as they drove through the darkness. They traveled for days, stopping only to rest and eat. The world outside the car windows changed. Rolling hills gave way to sprawling cities and then to quiet countryside again. They talked endlessly, sharing stories and dreams, filling in the gaps of the years they had lost. Edward learned about Amelia's life after the accident, about her struggles and triumphs, about the strength that had carried her through. And Amelia listened as Edward opened up about his guilt, his regrets, and the moments of light he had found in the church. One evening, as the sun set over a small coastal town, they pulled into a quiet inn by the sea. The air was salty and fresh, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, a soothing backdrop. They decided to stay for a while, to rest and plan their next steps. The town was charming, with cobblestone streets and colorful houses. The locals were friendly but not intrusive, and Edward and Amelia quickly found a rhythm to their days. They spent their mornings exploring the town, their afternoons walking along the beach, and their evenings talking by the fire. It was a simple life, but it was theirs. One night, as they sat on the porch of the inn, watching the stars, Amelia turned to Edward with a thoughtful expression. "What do you want, Charlie?" she asked. "Not what you think you should want, or what you've been told to want. What do you really want?" Edward was silent for a long moment, staring out at the dark horizon. "I want to be happy," he said finally, his voice soft but sure. "I want to live a life that's mine, not one I've built out of guilt or fear. I want to be with you." Emilia smiled, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "Then let's make that happen. Together." Months turned into years, and the coastal town became their home. Edward and Amelia built a life together, one filled with quiet moments and shared dreams. They married in a small ceremony by the sea, surrounded by a handful of friends they had made in the town. It was a simple celebration, but it was perfect, a testament to the love and forgiveness that had brought them together. Edward found work as a counselor, using his experiences to help others who were struggling with guilt and loss. It was a way to continue serving, but on his own terms. Emilia opened a small bookstore, filling it with stories that had inspired her throughout her life. They were happy, truly happy, in a way neither of them had thought possible. One evening, as they walked along the beach, Emilia turned to Edward with a smile. "Do you remember the girl from the accident?" she asked. "The one you thought you couldn't save?" Edward nodded, his heart tightening at the memory. "Of course. I'll never forget her." Amelia reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was the picture of the young girl from the accident, her smile bright and full of life. "I found this in an old box," she said. "I thought you might want to keep it." Edward took the photograph, his fingers trembling slightly. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked at Amelia. "Thank you," he said softly. "But I don't need it anymore. I've made my peace with the past. She's always with me, in here." He placed a hand over his heart. Amelia smiled, her eyes filled with love. "I'm proud of you, Charlie. You've come so far." Edward took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We've come so far, together." As they walked along the shore, the waves lapping at their feet, Edward felt a sense of peace he had never known before. The guilt that had haunted him for so long was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding love for the woman beside him. He had found redemption, not in the church or in penance, but in the simple act of living and loving. And when their daughter was born a year later, they named her after the girl Edward had tried to save all those years ago, a symbol of the past they had overcome and the future they had built together.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.